Just a second to introduce you to Lottie Bevan, producer at the Weather Factory, who is going to introduce us into the fine art of producing video games without a whip. Please, huge round of applause for her.
Thank you. Hi, so I'm Lottie. I'm from Weather Factory, and I'm talking today about how you can produce successful indie games. And in case I have misled anybody off the bat, I'm not talking about the one weird trick that producers don't want you to know, but how you can use production to give yourself a better chance of making a successful indie game rather than one that sinks maybe with less of a trace than you'd like. So I started out in games when I was producer at Fail Better Games. They are best known for literary RPGs like Fall in London and Sunless Sea. And I left at the end of last year with the original founder of Fail Better Games, Alexis Kennedy, who co-founded a new studio with me called Weather Factory. And we, to date, have released one game, Cultist Simulator. And, oh, look, you should buy it. And we've since released a bit of DLC as well. And it did much better than we expected when we launched it. It got to #1 on Steam and Humble, and I think GOG as well. It made over £1 million in revenue in its first month. And we were just totally blown away by what happened. And there's a lot of factors that went into this, definitely one of the biggest ones being luck. But I'm going to be talking a lot about what I think its strengths were for the rest of this talk. And I think one of the big things that had going for it is we really, really made sure that we had a very tight grip on the production side of making this game. We made sure we kept it, in scope and in budget all the way through. And I think that definitely helped it succeed when it released. The reason I think this is relevant for everyone here is essentially this image. Jake Burkett is a very established indie developer. He's best known for games like Regency Solitaire and Shadowhand, and he's been in the industry for like 10, 20 years. And he's very involved in the business side of making indie games. And he ran this poll on Twitter. And as you can tell, it's not a great picture for your average indie dev. Around 1 in 5 developers can expect to make a profit on their indie game, which is not ideal. And I'm going to be talking today about how you can be one of that 20%. There's a lot of things that happen when you launch a game that are beyond your control. You can't predict if Bethesda are going to soft launch a game on the same day that you release yours. You can't guarantee that the press are going to cover you and give you a boost when you actually release. But one of the things that you do really have in your control are things like budget and scoping. And it sounds boring, but I think actually it has a really key influence on the game that you make and the chances it has when you release it. So I'm firstly going to talk about how I think keeping that tight control over production can actually have a really interesting impact on the creative side of the games that you make. So the first thing to remember when you sit down to develop your indie game, when you start planning it out, if you intend to sell your game at any point, if you intend to put it on any storefront, remember that you are making a product. It is not just art. You are actually engaging in a business action. So I would highly recommend that you take this into account rather than just focusing on the fun, creative side like the design pillars and the art direction. Those are incredibly important, obviously, but it is more complex than that. So things like this is not remotely a comprehensive list, but I would advise you to consider slightly more business aspects of your design as well as the creative stuff. So let's take Cultist Simulator as an example. Theme is one of Alexis Kennedy's big strengths as a designer. He always makes sure he has a really clear idea of what the themes of his games are, which I think make them stronger. And with Cultist, we knew that we wanted it to be a game of apocalypse and yearning and give people the sense that they were constantly pulling back layers to reveal a better idea of the truth underneath. We also had a very clear idea what our unique selling proposition was for both us as a studio and Cultist as a game. So again, one of our strengths for the game and the studio was that Alexis is a really good writer. So we knew we wanted to make a narrative-first, text-based game. We wanted to play with mechanics and narrative and how they could mesh together, and a card-based interface made a lot of sense to do that. We wanted to give the player the experience that Lovecraft gives you without actually making a Lovecraftian game set in the Lovecraftian universe. And we really wanted to play with an idea called apophenia, which if you haven't come across it before, essentially means humans' desire to find patterns in things. So one of the best ways to describe it is if I draw 2 dots and a line on a bit of paper, a lot of people will look at that and see a face, even though it looks nothing like a human face. And that's because we're constantly trying to see patterns in things. So we deliberately baked into the design of Cultist a lot of space for the player to connect to the dot themselves and find the patterns that weren't immediately in front of them, which is a really satisfying creative experience. We also had a very clear idea of how much money we wanted to spend on the game and where. So we had a clear budget for our freelancers. And we knew, for example, that as a very small, very new studio, we were only going to have 2 full-time resources on the project, which made it very clear what we could expect of the project overall and what we could expect of ourselves. We worked out very clearly how much time we thought we needed to make the game. So when I joined in December of last year, we estimated we'd needed another 6 months or so to actually develop the game to completion, which meant it was an 11-month project overall, because Alexis had been working on it before I joined. So, very tightly scoped, very quick project. We had a very clear idea of the budget, because producers, and we had 2 different versions of the game that we could have made, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail later. And we had as good an idea as we could of the size and complexity of the project overall. Now remember, this is at the start of development, before you've got into the detail and you really understand the game like you do at the end. But we knew that we wanted around 4 playable characters that people could play through the narrative as. And we also compared it to Alexis's previous game, Sunless Sea, and said, roughly, we want it to be around 1/4 of the size of that game in terms of content. So that just gave us a very clear mental image of what we were aiming for and allowed us to develop the game with this goal in mind. So just to recap then, we knew from Jake that most people don't make a profit on their indie game. We knew from experience and from talking to other developers over the course of our careers that most people's first game does not make them money. It's usually your second or your third or even your 4th and later games that actually start making you profit. And we knew that as a new studio, we actually didn't have that much in the bank. We didn't have a lot of games out there that were making us revenue on a daily basis. We had some investment, but not a massive, pot of cash in the bank. So all of this combined made it really clear that we should keep Cultist a very low-budget project. And that is not the same thing as a bad project or a crap game, but we needed to be really, really clear on what we thought we wanted to put money into and what we thought wasn't going to make that much difference to the value of the game. We also, as I said, we're an extremely small team. There's literally 2 of us, and we work with freelancers. And we knew that together we have a history of being good at weird things. Uniqueness is one of our strengths. So this told us that Cultist was going to look like this. It's quite a artistically simple, paired-back game with a very clear card-based UI. And this allows the narrative to go nuts. The simplicity allows us to put, I think now, 110,000 words in a very complicated roguelike narrative game about founding your own cult. And this really played to our strengths as a studio. We didn't set out and say, oh, we're going to make a small version of No Man's Sky, because that wouldn't make any sense for where we were and where our business realities really, really were. So now this is the part of the talk where any developers in the room, I'm going to try and scare you, so bear with me. Take, if you will, a boat full of banjo players. They are playing sweet, sweet banjo music, and they're focusing very hard on playing the most beautiful banjo music they can. They're looking straight out at you because they're performers, they're really engaging with you, and they're super focused on the one task they have, which is to play those banjos as well as possible. For the purposes of this metaphor, these banjo players are developers. From a Production point of view, you really want your developers as focused as possible on the tasks at hand, because that means they are liable to produce the best quality work that they can. The flip side of this, of course, is if people are really focused, they won't take stock of what's going on around them. So these banjo players, for example, don't know they're in a boat. They don't know if the boat has holes in it. They don't know if there's anything lurking in the waters waiting to eat them. And they don't know how many other people are in the boat alongside them, all of which are salient points to note if you are in a boat. And this is why we have this dude. This guy, or Production, is tasked with looking at the context, not playing a banjo, so he can make up for the lack of awareness that the developers have, and hopefully allow the developers to continue their focus and improve, and do their best work without everyone crashing the boat. So because this production resource is looking around, he is aware of the constraints of the boat. He knows how big it is, he knows how many developers you can put in it before it sinks, he knows if there are holes in it, he knows that it can go forward and it can't go up, and it shouldn't go down, definitely. And he's looking around him and can see, over there is the closest port in case we run into trouble and need to dock and repair ourselves. Because he's looking around, he can also see the horrors lurking in the water that our banjo players / developers could not see. And because he's looking around for these people, he can steer the boat around them and hopefully avoid these horrors rather than running headfirst into them and dealing with the consequences. So I am a producer by trade, and yeah, I'm a producer, but because I'm working in a small team of only 2 people, I'm currently doing things other than production. I'm doing marketing, I'm doing biz, I'm doing a bit of the art. So I am being a bit of a hypocrite here, and my studio right now does not have a 100% full-time production resource looking out for these hidden dangers. And I think this is quite a common problem for a lot of indies. If you're small, if you're starting out, the first person you hire is not a producer. You hire the people who are actually going to make the game. And that's not ideal, but it is okay. But the thing you need to know about it is, if you do not have a full-time resource whose responsibility is to see all these hidden dangers and steer the boat around them, does it mean that these dangers disappear? Does it mean that you now are developing in an infinite boat capable of holding infinite people that will never spring a leak? Of course, the answer is no. And what I hope this shows you is something really frightening, that there are these hidden dangers out there waiting to eat you, and you have no idea where they are and no possibility of steering around them. So you will always run into them, and they will always hit you with their full force. And that is a very dangerous way to develop a video game. So if you don't have a full-time production resource, it's okay. You just need to make it really clear who in your team is responsible for being aware of this extra business context, and they will allow you to steer your ship around the problem, or at least get off as lightly as you possibly can. These realities are there, these horrors are waiting for you, and it's up to you whether or not you decide to look out for them or not. So as a summary then, production brings the reality of your specific situation to life. They tell you how much money you can spend on your game. They tell you how long they think it's going to take. They give you these really useful limitations, which hopefully enable your creative team, your developers, to do their best work in the safe confines of understanding the reality in which they're developing. And this should mean that when you launch your game, that you don't suddenly find that it's a total surprise on launch and you've massively overspent and you're totally broke and have to disband, because nobody wants that. It is worth saying one thing before we move on, that I have been in situations where this first arrow has gone the other way, and developers have gone off and come up with some really great creative ideas for the games they want to make, and then they come to production and say, right, how do we make this happen? And in that situation, production has to say a lot of no. Production has to say, you don't have the money, you haven't got the resource, you haven't got the time, and that's a really miserable situation for everyone involved. Contrary to what you might believe, producers do not actually enjoy crushing dreams. Thank you. It's not nice to have to say to a developer, that isn't possible, we can't do that thing. And obviously, it's not fun for the developer at all, because they've come up with an amazing idea and it's going to be the best game, and they either have to not do it and abandon it, or they have to really crush it and break off its limbs to make it fit in the reality that exists. So I'd highly encourage you as developers to work out the reality that you're in right now, and then let yourselves go wild within those safe limitations. And that should make sure that everybody has a good time. Right, so for the rest of the talk, I'm just going to go through a quick list of everything that I would expect, all the basic stuff I would expect indie developers to be doing as part of their production over the course of their project. So firstly, every project has 3 phases, the first of which is an insane GIF that is playing very badly. So this is going to make people very stressed out, but I'll go through it quickly. Pre-production is the phase where you're trying to answer as many questions as you possibly can. You want to know how much money you have to spend on the game. You want to know if you own the legal rights to the IP you want to make. You want to know how big your game is. And the idea is you're trying to answer as many questions before you get into production, because production is a really long, complicated beast, and you want to make it as easy as possible for yourselves once you get there. So pre-production is super important for figuring all that stuff out before it becomes a real problem later down the line. Weather Factory is probably going to be supporting Cultist until about April of next year, at which point we will move on to our next project. So an example of something in pre-production is Weather Factory's next project. And for that project, we're doing all the stuff that I'm talking about today. We then, of course, have a GIF that apparently is happy to play, which is production. Now, production, like I said, is the longest and most difficult part of game dev, but remember that in theory, it should be as simple as an iterative process of going through a list of stuff that you have written down during pre-production, and you do all the tasks that you've worked out you need to do, and you go from not having a game to having a game. It is that simple in theory. In practice, of course, you run into all the problems and all the hidden dangers that I've mentioned, but don't forget or lose sight of the fact that you should just feel like you're going through a list of tasks and you feel constantly your game is progressing until you get to the point where, oh, look, you actually have a game you can ship. So I said, I think, that we are developing and releasing a couple of bits of DLC for Cultist at the minute. So these 2 bits of DLC are currently in production, just to give you an example. And finally, this is not something I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk, but it is really important, I think, for everyone to be aware of post-launch. It used to be that really only people who were making free-to-play games needed to worry about a really comprehensive post-launch plan, because when you make a free-to-play game, you kind of assume that you're going to have free content updates and DLC and seasonals, and you need to make sure that your player base remains engaged. But I think now, even for premium indie devs, increasingly, you need to have a plan of attack for what happens once you've launched. And that might be, here's the plan for DLC, here's the free content we expect to do. It might be, here's plans A through G, which we will put in action depending on how successful our launch is. But I certainly made the mistake when I was making Cultist of planning our marketing up until launch, and then like nothing. I just apparently was just not going to sell our game from literally day 1 after we launched, which was stupid, and you shouldn't do that. So an example of something in post-launch is, of course, Cultist, which launched in May of this year. And our plan is the kind of paradox model of a balance between free content and paid DLC. Right, so pre-production. This is something I've talked about a lot, so let's go into detail. The first thing when you sit down to start designing and planning out your game is to work out the rough size and complexity of the project. So you need to know if you're making a Pong, if you're making a Stardew, or if you're making a Red Dead. And either one of these is fine. I don't want to curb your enthusiasm or say you can't do something, because it all entirely depends on your studio and your resources. But the key thing is not to think that you're making a Pong and actually be making a Red Dead, because that way all of your expectations will be in the wrong place and you'll run into trouble. So there's lots of ways that you can work out the size and scope of your game. I've mentioned that Cultist talked about these 4 different legacies, these 4 different characters. This is for the hardcore players. We committed very early with Cultist to a release date. I think about 6 months in advance. We said, we're going to launch on the 31st of May. And this is a very effective scoping tool, because you know that you have a set amount of time within which you can complete your game. So that really focuses your mind on what bits of the game are important and what bits of the game you need to hurry up on and do now. And we exhibited at EGX Resd in London, which is a dev event. And I got this big banner printed, and it had our hero art and, Cultist Simulator from the creator of Fallen London and Sunless Sea, coming on the 31st of May, 2018. And I got a bunch of devs kind of sidling up to me over the event, and they kind of looking at the screen and saying, oh, printed your release date on your banner, huh? Bold. And there is, I think, as indies, a fear of release dates. We don't like them when they worry us and they slip. And I get that, and production can be difficult. But they can be, if you are bold and confident in your production, a really useful way of working out the size and complexity of your game. Another very effective but blunt instrument is budget. How much money do you actually have to spend on the game you want to make? And then make sure that you don't make a game that's too expensive. Or, of course, you have that sort of mental image of a comparison to games that you've worked on in the past, which is a really useful, just sort of general finger in the air of the kind of thing that you're going for before you get stuck into the detail. Once you've got an idea of the size, you can move on to whether or not you actually have the money to make the game you want to make. It is not a problem if you do not have that money. You just need to know early so you can look into other opportunities, whether that's external funding or a publisher or crowdfunding, whatever. But the idea is you want to solve this problem before it becomes a problem when you're halfway through development and you spent a year making a game that you can no longer afford to make. And then, of course, you get to what I think is the most important part of pre-production overall, which is the big list of stuff. You need to write down, during pre-production, as complete a list as you possibly can of all the tasks that you think you need to do to go from not having a game to having a game. So that's all the art tasks, all the design tasks, all everything, in as much detail as you can muster. And it's really hard to do this bit. It's painful and hard, but the better you do it, the better your production will go, and the clearer you will understand your project. So I'll come back to that in a bit more detail later. And finally, you have this great opportunity for a reality check. I've mentioned that Cultist looks like this, and it looks like this because our USP is that Alexis is a really good writer. So it didn't make sense for us to set out and be like, I'm going to make a 3D walking sim like Chinese Room, and it's going to be amazing, because we don't have a 3D artist, and we're good with words. So once you've worked out the shape and the skeleton of the game you want to make, just stop and double check that the people you have and the person you are makes sense for the game that you want to make. It should be a good fit. Again, if it's not, this is not a disaster. You just want to identify that you don't have some skills or you'll need something else before you start the project, so you have an opportunity to go out and find whatever is missing before it becomes a problem. And you're going to see this guy a lot through the rest of this presentation. He is the spectre of production, and he is just there to remind you that everything on this slide is there to help you steer your boat around the horrors that await you in development before they become problems. The whole point of mostly anything in production is to help you identify issues as a kind of early warning system, so you can avoid them altogether, or at least have as little damage to your ship and your studio as possible. So estimates. I talked about that big list of stuff that you really need to do in pre-production that's painful and hateful, but you still have to do it. To make that useful, you need to make sure you have a rough idea of how long that list is going to take. So you need to estimate your tasks. So you can say, oh, this project needs about 6 months of art and 12 months of code, rather than just saying, I don't know, we've got to do some work. And when I ask developers for estimates, I tend to get the same response. And that response is this. People hate estimating. They find it stressful and hard, and I think people feel like they're making a noose for their own neck, because you're kind of having to say, I can do this in this amount of time before you understand the work involved. And I get that. But I'm afraid, again, they are necessary, so you kind of got to buckle up. But there is good news. However bad you are at estimating stuff, anything you give a producer is better than nothing, because with no estimates at all, I can't do anything. I can't plan anything or estimate how big and how many problems we're going to run into. Even if you give me the world's worst estimate, at least it's a start. And the way that estimates work is you estimate something, and then you actually do the work, and almost immediately you have a much better idea of actually how long it will take you to do work like that later down the line in the project. So you will find that over the course of development, you get better at estimates and they become more accurate. And remember that however terrible you are at them and how much you hate them, you will only get better, and they're better than not doing anything at all. Once you have your estimate, of course, you can then finally do the big reality check that is budgeting. So essentially, you work out how many people are working on the game, how long they're working on the game for, and then you times that by how much they cost. And that obviously has to be combined with things like a freelancer budget and marketing and legal and all this stuff. And I would also strongly advise you to incorporate contingency. As a rule of thumb, I always add on an extra 20% contingency to my game budgets, and I think to date, I have never worked on an indie project that did not really need that 20% contingency at the end. I've never finished a game and been like, ooh, 50K in the bank, great. That's not how this works. So please let me encourage you to incorporate contingency into your budgets. This is actually the Cultist Simulator budget, the real thing, and you can see that on the left, we have that smaller scoped, kind of no frills attached Cultist Simulator budget. And on the right, we have a slightly larger, more expensive version of Cultist, which simply incorporated a bunch of localization and some porting. So we ended up going with the cheaper version, the no frills attached, because as I said at the start, all these business realities were very strongly pushing us to not spend too much money on our game. And the budget is another prime example of an early warning system. Once you've got all your budget allocated, you can really clearly see, okay, well, I think I've got 60 grand's worth of art in this game. And that means that all the way through the project, you can be saying, right, well, today I've spent 50 grand, but I'm only halfway through development. So that's a sign that I'm actually going to spend more money on this game than I think I was going to spend, or that I need to de-scope elsewhere to make sure that the budget remains the same when I finish the game. So this is really here to help you. We ended up spending 141K on Cultist, and I'm really proud of this. I swear to God, it was actually going to be 131 on the nose, but at the last minute, we got an opportunity to spend another 10K on a bunch of digital ads at launch, which we decided to do, and knowingly increase the budget. So we were really, really careful about money. And what was lovely is that we did increase it by 10K, but we felt confident enough to do that because we had such a clear vision on everything to do with the reality and the expense and the production of Cultist. We felt that we knew all the information, so we could say, yeah, we feel safe increasing the budget by 10K, and that was fine. Right, so now you have smashed pre-production, you are so ready to make your game. Let's move on to production. So this is an actual sprint from Cultist Simulator. We work in Agile. What you're looking at is a screenshot of a software called Hack and Plan, which is an indie production software that I'm a fan of. You don't have to use it, obviously. But what I like about it is it's essentially a Kanban system. And Kanban, for those of you who don't know, is essentially a very simple visual way of working and developing games. You have a bunch of columns that essentially go from work that is planned to work that is completed. And what I like about this is you get an immediate gauge of how you're doing versus your deadlines just by looking at it. So if I look at my sprint, and it's day 6 of a 10-day sprint, and there's loads of tasks in the planned column and not that much in the complete column, that's an early warning that maybe I'm not going to hit my deadline, and maybe I should go talk to my developers or move things around. So I'm not surprised when we get to the end of the sprint, because I can see, as we approach it, how we're doing and how our progress is. So again, Mr. Spectre of production is here to help us. I think it's worth saying, as we're talking about production, that developers, indie developers particularly, tend to have a slightly difficult relationship with work-life balance. I think everyone really wants to do the best game they possibly can, which leads some people to overwork. So we hear a lot of crunch. Now, just to confirm what I mean by crunch, something along the lines of noticeable overwork for a period of 2 weeks or more. So, everybody occasionally works a couple extra hours, but I'm talking about a prolonged period of really not having a good work-life balance. And there is one thing that you need to know about crunch as an indie dev, and I can't speak for AAA because I've never worked in AAA, but for indies, crunch is total bullshit. You should never, ever have to do it. It is not part and parcel of game dev. It is, in fact, a symptom of something having gone wrong. So if you are an indie and you are in crunch right now, there is a problem and you should not accept it. I think there are 2 reasons why indies crunch. And the first one is that the person in charge of your scheduling has made a mistake. and they have not scheduled properly, and they have accidentally scheduled too much work to do in too little time, and you are suffering the consequences of it. Or the person who is in charge of your scheduling doesn't care that you are going to have to work extra hours, and they have knowingly scheduled too much work to do in too little time. And I don't think either of those are okay, and they are certainly not like good production. So please just know, if you are crunching, it is wrong, and something should change. I will also just say, as well as the work-life balance thing, I think indies have a very loose description sometimes of what counts as done. Often I will say to a developer, oh, is task 743 done? And they will say, yes, but, in which case it's not. Or they will say, yes, and in their head they'll be thinking, oh, I've just got to remember to do that, flick that switch on launch day, or do that thing over there. Again, it's not actually done. Completion is a binary state. Something is complete or something is not complete. And the reason this is important is because I mentioned that production is really long and complicated, and the best thing that you can do for your team is to give your developers focus. And if your team are constantly having to remember all those 8 or 12 or 50 little things that they need to remember to do to actually finish the task that everyone else thinks is finished, they're not going to be focusing, and you're not solving the issue. So it is tempting to pretend that something's done when it's not, because it's annoying and you're tired and you want to stop. But please try and resist that, because you're not going to solve the issue by pretending something isn't done. These horrors are going to lie in wait for you, and I promise you they will surface around about launch, where you have the least time, you're the most emotional, and you're the most exhausted. So you're not doing anybody any favors by pretending something is complete when it's not. But there is good news. Production is essentially built to support developers. It is a discipline entirely built around fixing problems and helping studios and helping developers in whatever way is required. So that could mean anything from everybody's favorite cutting features, which is not popular but is extremely effective. It could be finding other sources of revenue. It could be speaking to publishers to help you out of a hole. It could be identifying parts of the project that are less significant so they can be simplified so that other parts of the project can grow and blossom. Or it could be as simple as making sure that all of the developers have taken a holiday recently and are happy and healthy and able to do their best work. Whatever you bring to production, it should theoretically be able to fix that problem for you. And the more time you can give it, the easier it will be to solve the problem in a very satisfying way. So I've talked about a lot of things today. Just to wrap up with the key bits, we learned from Mr. Burkett that most developers will not make a profit on their indie game. So be really, really careful about your scope and your budget, and keep a really clear eye on how it's going through development. A lot of things are beyond your control when you launch a game, but production is not. It's a really fantastic way to make sure you have as good a chance of being in that 20% of fortunate, profitable developers as possible. The creativity and reality is a blend. The mix of production and all the creative fun stuff that goes into development can have really interesting creative outcomes, like we saw in Cultist. Production is essentially an early warning system. All of its slightly arcane and slightly annoying systems are set up to give you as much information and as much warning in advance of an issue being an issue, so you can hopefully avoid the issue altogether. And remember, of course, that production is there to serve you, and it's really good at solving problems. So some people have a slightly troubled relationship with production as being a developer, but remember, it is there to help you, and usually it can. So that is everything from me. Thank you very, very much. Do we have time for questions? Great.
Thank you, Lottie. We've got a few minutes for some questions. Raise your hand if you want to ask anything. Que si queréis preguntar algo, que levantéis la mano, por favor. ¿Alguna pregunta por ahí?
So I wanted to ask you, how much can a producer get involved with the design of the game itself? Like, in which way they can get involved, or if it's better to avoid that situation?
So that's a really good question, actually. This is a slightly glib response, but one of the most useful things I've ever heard in game dev is you can either be in the business or on the business. And if you are trying to get that kind of production high-level view of the context in which everyone's working, you lose that very quickly if you actually get involved in the detail of a game. So I would say that the less detail a producer is involved with in terms of the creative stuff, the better that producer will be able to perform their duties. So producers will have a really useful insight into the creative stuff that you were doing, but if your producer is also a designer or also an artist or does a bit of the extra creative work because it needs to be done, they will lose their ability to see the big picture and be objective. So yeah, I would keep those boundaries as strong as possible.
Quick question now. It's a privilege of microphone, I can ask my own questions. Do you think it's feasible for an indie company which can't employ a full-time producer to outsource producing the game, having someone out of the team they can relate to and they can talk to make sure they are fulfilling the, I don't know, the milestones or whatever?
Absolutely. There's a lot of freelance producers out there, and that does give you a lot of distance. So those freelance producers won't come in and feel like the game is their baby and feel emotional about it. They'll be able to come in and say, these things are problems, fix them, and in a way that somebody involved with the project couldn't. So the problem you get with freelance producers or outsourced producers is that they need to understand the project in and out to get a sense of your vision creatively and also a sense of where the studio is in terms of its business stuff. So you might need to be more careful that they're spun up properly. But yes, I think an outsourced producer is absolutely fine.
Thank you. Next question, if there's any. Oh, yep. Bottom of there. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah. So I'm a student and I don't really have budget problems, but we are midway developing a game and we have realized that our estimates weren't real and everything's going to shit and the game won't be finished. So have you got like any tips for reorienting projects midway through development so that you can actually release the game?
So I think you need to identify what part of your project can be moved. Because if you continue as you are, it sounds like you're going to miss your release date. So I think your question is, can you move that release date? And if you can't move your release date, can you change the scope of your project and cut some features? And if you can't do either of those things, can you find more money or more resource to develop more quickly? It depends very much on what is really important for your project. So if you're a student and you need to release a game for an exam and you can't move the deadline, I would strongly advise you to de-scope. And produce a smaller version. And it will really hurt because you are in the detail and you know what the game could be, but I guarantee you that most people who then play that game will not be like, oh, I would have liked this game if it had all this features in it. Most people who play it will think, oh yes, this is a cool game, because they won't see what you can see. But I can't give you a more specific answer than that without noting the details.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Next question. We still have time for one last one. This way. No te preocupes.
Hi. Taking into account a project that is made by people who are also taking part in other jobs and don't have that much time, and maybe some weeks they can work on the project, how could you plan production, taking into account that some weeks might fail or might have to get moved or whatever?
So you're saying, how would you plan production assuming that some internal deadlines are going to move?
Yeah.
Okay, so again, really good question. I would highly recommend that you have your kind of features that have to happen, your kind of top line, these are the core heart of the game, and then you have some more nice to have features that you really want to get in, but what you'll do is over the course of development, depending on how far you slip past your initial deadlines, you'll decide that, okay, these 4 features that are nice to have will no longer be in the game because we cannot make those features anymore. And this system should ensure that you make the game you want to make with all the features you really care about, but you don't suffer too much from slipping deadlines.
Okay, thank you.
One very fast question before we go.
Yes.
Do you have any instances of you pulling the trick of, this is not a bug, it's a feature?
Oh, like all the time. I can't think any off the top of my head. We had a build halfway through development of Cultist Simulator, which we didn't QA terribly well. So we released it. It wasn't like a release state. It was during beta, so it's fine. But it was riddled with bugs, and for a lot of players, it didn't work, and it was a bad experience. Now, we fortunately, because we're a narrative-led studio, give all our release builds quite sort of nice names, and we happen to have named this build after one of the characters in the game. So rather than everyone who played this basically bad version of the game going away and thinking, Weather Factory are stupid and they can't make games, they went away and thought that Neville, who was the character that we named the build after, Neville's character was a sort of slightly useless man, and he was always making mistakes. So it made perfect sense that the build that we released with his name on it was a bit rubbish. And we were like, yes, we knew that. And we did not know that.
Thank you very much. Please, huge applause for Lottie. Thank you very much.
Thank you.